Good afternoon and welcome to the NDP Leadership Forum. I'm Vaughn Palmer and here are the candidates. Mike Farnworth, Adrian Dix, John Horgan, and Dana Larson. And the panel, Keith Baldry from Global Television, Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail newspaper. Format this afternoon is very straightforward. We'll have questions from the panel. Each candidate will have a chance to answer. Then the candidates will have a chance to ask each other a question. We'll have another round of questions from the panel, another session where the candidates get to ask each other questions, closing statements, and we'll be done. Let's go. First question is from Keith Baldry, and it goes to candidate Mike Farnworth.
Thanks very much, Vaughn. Well, gender politics has been turned on its ear in this province. The reason you're here is because your party forced a woman to step down as leader. How do you envision yourself, how do you approach running against a woman as leader, given that the Liberals have chosen a woman as the party leader?
I think the real issue is not the gender of the leader, but the policies of the particular political party. And after 10 years of BC Liberal rule in this province, people are ready for a change. I think what's important is that we have a positive, progressive agenda that speaks to the values, the concerns, and the aspirations of British Columbians. And if we do that and show that we're united as a caucus and as a party with that vision that speaks to the concerns and the issues that British Columbians have, then I think we can fight the election campaign. I think the BC Liberals believe that the answer to their problems was just to change leaders. I believe the public are 2 steps ahead of them and that they want to change government.
Thank Mike Farnworth for that answer. The next answer comes from Adrian Dix.
Well, I think there are real differences between myself and Christy Clark on the key issues, and I think women voters are going to respond positively to our agenda. On health care, I put forward a plan to improve public health care, improve care for seniors, ensure that primary care exists in rural communities. Christy Clark has proposed $500 million in cuts. On education, I proposed treating teachers with respect and addressing issues of class size and composition. Christy Clark takes the opposite view. In fact, the last time I debated with her on the radio, she wanted to close more schools in British Columbia. I support jobs throughout British Columbia and supporting communities. The BC Liberals have another agenda. And I think when we put the clear differences before the voters, that I'll win that election and the NDP will win a majority government, both among women and among men.
John Horgan, your answer.
Well, when we were in government, the BC NDP had a Ministry of Women's Equality. Our record on women's issues is unparalleled. I believe certainly that the BC Liberals hoped to change the channel by removing the Premier, Gordon Campbell, and replacing him with another face, another personality. The challenges of British Columbia are significant, and personality is not going to solve the problems of the 21st century. I believe British Columbians want a government that puts them first, puts people at the head of the agenda, not corporations, not vested interests, but regular folks. I believe that I can bring to the debate, and not just in this leadership debate, but also as Premier, a real focus on families, not just as a slogan, but a genuine concern and commitment to the people that built this province, the people that get up every day to go to work. Those are the people that government should be responding to, not special interests, not those that already have lobbyists and lawyers to take care of their interests, but people who want politicians to respect and value the work that they do in communities and support it.
Dana Larson, your answer.
Well, I don't think the voters of BC are overly interested in the gender of our Premier. I think they want policies and platforms that represent their needs and that make sure that regular people are taken care of. And the Liberals have been really attacking our healthcare system, attacking our educational system, dismantling BC Hydro. There's so many things that have been happening that need to change, and it's the BC NDP that can change that. I run my platform on 4 pillars: democracy, sustainability, social justice, and smart on crime. And I think the people of British Columbia really need clear policies and a clear vision for the NDP about where we're going and where we'll take this province. And I think that's far more important than the gender of our party leaders. I think women and men in this province need a party in charge that is going to take care of regular people and not focused on the benefits of the corporate elite. The NDP is the party of the people, and I really hope that we form the next government. Thank you.
And thank you, Dana Larson, for that answer. The next question for the panel comes from Justine Hunter of the Globe and Mail. Justine.
So the NDP government in Manitoba has reduced taxes on small business to 0. So if reducing taxes on small business creates jobs, why wouldn't reducing taxes on other businesses do the same thing?
Well, I propose.
It goes to Adrian Dix, and I should have said that.
I proposed a very different plan than that. We propose as well, and we accept the reduction in the small business income tax. But I propose a very different plan on taxation issues. I think it's important to be specific. So I propose rolling back the tax cuts on January 1st, 2011, January 1st, 2010, and July 1st, 2008, and using that money to invest in communities, like fixing rural public education and rural public health care. On the issue of banks, though, and it's an important question, Justine, in 2007 the government announced the elimination of the minimum tax on banks, a tax that had been in place for many years in BC. Since that was announced, and since the tax has been eliminated, we've lost banking jobs to Ontario. I believe that banks should contribute as well to the public services in BC. And at the same time, we should remember that those tax cuts to business and those tax cuts to the banks were subsidized by increases in MSP premiums and long-term care fees.
And John Horgan, your answer.
Well, certainly the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives issued a report just last week, Justine. There was a report, I think, on the front page of your paper talking about tax cuts for corporations not generating jobs in British Columbia, not generating jobs right across the board. What I proposed in this campaign is to have a fair tax commission immediately upon forming government, so that all British Columbians can have a real, genuine understanding of where we get revenue from resource rentals, on our natural gas, on our water, on our stumpage, on forestry, personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, property transfer taxes, MSP premiums. The list goes on and on and on. I'm paying attention, and I can't keep track of the various and sundry changes in our tax system over the past 10, 15 years. And on top of that, we're going to have to manage and deal with the HST. I believe we need to deal with taxes fairly and openly, and that's what I'll do.
And Dana Larson, your answer?
Well, when the Liberals came into power, they really promised that these tax rollbacks that they brought in would increase jobs, increase investment, and benefit our province. But none of that has happened. All we've seen is a big gaping hole in our budget, which has resulted in a deficit. So as Premier, I would roll back all of the corporate tax cuts that the Liberals brought in. And even that wouldn't be enough to solve our financial problems the Liberals have left us. I would also create a new top tax bracket for earners who bring home more than $250,000 a year. I would increase the marginal tax rate on that top 0.6% of income earners in our province by 11%. And these two changes would allow us to meet our entire budget deficit in our first term and leave us with a $500 million surplus. And I'd put that money into K-12 education where it belongs. I believe that everyone needs to pay their fair share in society, and that includes corporations and the top income earners in our province.
And the last answer on this question comes from Mike Farnworth.
I think the issue is not the small business tax rate, which we have supported as being low, and it's been traditionally low in British Columbia under NDP administrations, and that's the approach that I would take as Premier. I think the real question is around tax fairness and a sense that people are seeing corporations getting significant tax cuts at the same time they're seeing their expenses going up. Nowhere is this better illustrated than the debate around the HST. You know, the HST is a $2 billion tax shift from the corporate sector to ordinary British Columbians. The real issue is what is going to happen in the HST referendum, because that is going to have a significant impact on tax policy in British Columbia. And I think we need to be making tax policy on the basis of all the information. That's how good public policy is made. And crucial to that is the decision that the people of this province will be making on the 24th of June with regards to the HST.
Well, next question comes from me, and it starts off with John Horgan. The last time we went into a provincial election campaign with teachers' negotiations ongoing and a contract expiring, the NDP budget in that election in 2005 included no money for a raise for BC teachers. Do you support a raise for teachers this time, and how big a raise?
I do support a raise for teachers in British Columbia. I also support transferring responsibility for class size and class composition away from legislation that's not working today. We have 13,000 classrooms that are not in compliance with the BC Liberal class size and class composition legislation. I believe that we should be putting class size and class composition back on the local bargaining table so that teachers, school trustees, and administrators can manage this very important and crucial issue locally, so they can come up with solutions that meet the needs of school districts right across British Columbia. One size doesn't fit all. In my constituency, I have 2 school districts, one with a declining enrollment, one with an increasing enrollment, and the BC Liberals approach those school districts with the same formula. It doesn't work. We need to revise the funding formula, and we need to address wages in classrooms.
Dana Larson.
Well, I think teachers definitely should be paid a fair wage, and I think this trend of blaming teachers for the financial problems in our society is really misguided and misplaced. But more importantly than that, I think we have to work to reopen rural schools as well. We've seen over 190 schools closed by the Liberals since they came into power, and many of these schools are in rural communities. And I think forcing students to travel a 3-hour round trip to get a high school education is a failed policy, especially when many of those students are Aboriginals, and our Aboriginal high school graduation rate in this province is less than 50%. Graduating from high school is a key indicator in all kinds of life success, health, and clearly we want to make sure that as many people as possible are graduating from high school, and that includes rural communities. So I strongly support a well-funded, accessible educational system, and that's why I've pledged to put $500 million into K-12 education in my first year of office. Thank you.
Over to you, Mike Farnworth.
I believe that teachers, like other public sector workers, deserve a pay increase, as do workers in the private sector. I think the real issue is the way that this government has been treating teachers and its public service in general with disrespect. I think a government's responsibility is to negotiate in good faith, to recognize that their job is to get the best deal for the taxpayer, but to treat their employees, the public service, fairly and negotiate in good faith. We haven't seen that in this province. I also think that we need to recognize that there's some non-monetary issues that teachers are particularly concerned about. Class size and composition. The government has legislation in place regarding that. They've ignored that. The approach that I would take would be to recognize that if there is legislation, then it should be honored. If it's not, then let's sit down and negotiate a solution that works for the province, it works for teachers, it works for parents as well. We've got to get rid of this, or get away from this idea that we should be confrontational and pitting parents against teachers, against school boards. It doesn't work.
And Adrian Dix.
Well, unlike the current government, I believe in free collective bargaining, and that's what I would engage in with teachers and other public sector workers. I think particularly we need to ensure that class size and composition is part of those negotiations. You know, when we negotiated class size and composition with teachers, we didn't see 12,000 classrooms failing to meet the composition limits and 4,000 classrooms failing to meet the class size limits. In fact, teachers fought for students in the classroom, and we need to treat teachers as partners again to improve learning. And finally, I think in one issue that certainly I agree with the position of the BCTF on is on the Foundation Skills Assessment, a program that has damaged the reputation of our public schools, only serves as a fundraising tool for the Fraser Institute, and doesn't provide any resources to the classrooms that need help in our province.
And we now go to the next format that we're going to use. In this one, the candidates get to ask each other a question. And the first question is Dana Larson, and he gets to decide who he wants to ask it to. Dana Larson.
Sure, I'd like to ask John Horgan a question. You know, going around BC on this leadership tour has brought home many of the realities of the problems with BC Hydro and the run-of-the-river scam. And despite Liberal promises that these independent power projects would be safe for our rivers and they would benefit the people of British Columbia, we've really seen the opposite happening. So with BC Hydro rates set to go up by 30% over the next 3 years, how do you feel about independent power projects, and what would you do as Premier to fix BC Hydro?
Thanks for the question, Dana. I believe that BC Hydro was the envy of North America with respect to an electricity utility that has water as its foundation. Our reservoirs separate us from other jurisdictions in North America. The BC Liberals in 2002 directed BC Hydro only to buy new sources of supply from private producers within the boundaries of British Columbia. That has led to purchasing power in some instances for $120 a megawatt hour when the market rate fluctuates between $35 and $40 a megawatt hour. That buy high and sell low strategy is putting BC Hydro on the verge of bankruptcy. We need to ensure that the contracts that were signed by BC Hydro and these private producers are opened up for scrutiny so we can determine that they were in the public interest. The BC Utilities Commission is the best vehicle to do that. They have looked at the contracts in a cursory way. We need to have them look at these contracts to ensure the public interest has been protected. I don't believe the BC Liberals have done that.
And the next question is Mike Farnworth.
My question is for Adrian. Adrian, I made it clear in this campaign that in order for us to win the next election, we have to be united as a caucus and united as a party. I've managed to bring together people from within caucus from both sides of the problems that we're facing during the last several months, as well as people from outside the party, former Premier Mike Harcourt, Corky Evans, the former cabinet minister, and MLAs representing a wide diversity of points of view. Adrian, what's your plan to unite our caucus?
I think I've been showing it in this leadership campaign, running a positive campaign of respect, Mike, for all the candidates in the race. I've worked with you for 25 years. I've worked with John for 25 years. I got to know Dana, and he's doing an excellent job. And I believe that I've given the example that needs to be set, which is that if I'm elected, I'll work with every member of caucus and every leadership campaign. And if I'm not elected, and everybody who knows me knows this, I will give everything I can to make whoever wins the Premier of British Columbia. I treat people with respect all the time. You know, I have lots of great endorsements across British Columbia. Joy McPhail and Bill Thielman, Bruce Ralston and Harry Baines, Sue Hamill, Michelle Mungal, Mabel Elmore. I've got lots of endorsements. But ultimately, I think this election is about the voters, the members of the NDP who will decide. And my job is to give a positive message and to ask for their support in this leadership campaign.
And Mike Farnworth, you didn't use all of your time in asking your questions, so you do have time for a brief rebuttal if you wish.
No, that's fine.
He passes. We're going to compile a little bit extra time here. That's good. We might get an extra question in if we do. Adrian Dix gets to ask a question. Go ahead, Adrian.
Sure, I'll ask a question to John. John, you've proposed and mentioned earlier today a fair tax commission. When would that tax commission report, and what would you say about taxes during an upcoming election campaign?
Well, I would propose, or I have proposed, that the Fair Tax Commission would begin within the first 30 days of our taking government and would report back within the first 4 months of that mandate. I believe not a word that comes from the Minister of Finance, whether it be the previous one or the current one. I believe we need to have a good hard look at the books before we start setting tax policy on the fly. I've agreed with you, Adrian, on some of your initiatives with respect to rolling back tax cuts for large banks that didn't generate any job creation whatsoever, just created a larger hole in our budget. But I do believe that we've had too much tax policy on the fly, and we need to have a thoughtful, methodical look at all of our taxes so that the public can have some confidence that when they're taking money out of their pockets and giving it over to government, that they're doing it in the best interest of all British Columbians. In my community and in communities right across BC, people are prepared to pay their fair share of taxes, provided they're going to the services that they want, and that's what I would do as Premier.
And Adrian, you have a bit of time left over if you'd like to say a bit more on that issue as a rebuttal.
Yeah, just like you, John, and like Mike and Dana, I've made proposals to spend money in this campaign. And I think it's fair, and it's just a difference in approach. I think the Fair Tax Commission is a very good idea, but it's a difference in approach. I believe going into an election campaign, you have to tell people what you're going to do and how you're going to pay for it. I don't think in a campaign it would make sense to say to people, I'll tell you which taxes I'll raise 3 months after the election. It's a difference in strategy and approach. I think we agree on a lot of the fundamentals, but I think my approach, which is to be clear with people, to say what taxes I'd raise and what services that I'd add, is a more effective approach of getting votes and getting the support of British Columbians and getting a mandate for real change after the election.
And John Horgan, you get to ask a question.
Well, I'll ask my question to Dana Larson. Dana, you've been in this campaign talking about sustainability, talking about democratizing the NDP and increasing access to democratic tools for citizens right across the piece. But you've also been talking about marijuana, and which is predominantly a federal jurisdiction. You've talked about the obstacles to medicinal marijuana dispensaries. You've been talking about the obstacles that citizens have who use medical marijuana to alleviate pain. What role would the province play in relieving some of these obstacles that you've been talking about over the past few months?
Well, that's a good question, John, and I appreciate that, because it is true that the laws against marijuana are federal laws. But I think we could have a premier in British Columbia that stands up for what is ultimately one of our province's largest industries. It employs 250,000 people. It's worth over $1 billion in revenue we could generate if we taxed and regulated marijuana. I'd like to see our premier ask the Prime Minister to change those laws. But more importantly, in terms of provincial jurisdiction, we have medicinal marijuana. Healthcare is provincial jurisdiction. Just like Insight is now a provincial jurisdiction program, I also believe that medicinal marijuana dispensaries should be provincial jurisdiction as well. So as Premier, I would make sure that we license and regulated the production of medicinal cannabis, that we license the dispensaries that exist now, and the many more that are already opening across this province. We have an industry that is growing rapidly. More dispensaries are opening in the Lower Mainland and across British Columbia every day. I think it's important that the Premier take a stand to license and regulate and help these patients get the medicine they need.
Thank you, Dana. You have a bit of time left on the clock. John Horgan, do you want to use it?
Well, I will. I think that the issues that you brought forward with respect to sustainability also have a hemp component as well. You've talked about using hemp for construction. You've talked of using hemp for fiber in terms of pulp and for other uses in the economy. And I think that's a discussion that British Columbians want to have. I believe that's a discussion that British Columbians should have, and I've supported you in that regard.
And we're back to the panel here, and another question from Keith Baldry, and Keith Baldry's question goes to Mike Farnworth.
Thanks, Juan. BC is the only province with Medicare premiums, and they've increased by almost 20% over 3 years, increases you've all been critical of. Would you roll back those increases, or would you scrap Medicare premiums entirely? If so, how would you make up the loss in revenue, which would range from hundreds of millions of dollars to $2 billion? How do you make up that money?
Well, that's a great question, and I think we need to recognize that the government has been making tax cuts and then piling on fee increases onto regular families in this province, and that's been making life difficult for families. I think the approach we need to do is to look at where we get our health care funding from, how it takes place. I want to hold our Medicare premiums to where they are right now and not see those increases. In terms of funding, I think the real issue facing us right now is, one, to be smarter in terms of how we spend our health care dollars. That means making sure we're investing more in preventative care, that we're dealing with some of the key cost drivers such as seniors care and the costs associated with that by making sure we've got better home care for seniors, that we're not keeping seniors in acute care beds, that there's the long-term care facilities available for them. But right now, there's a very important issue that's playing out, hopefully within the federal election, the new government is going to have to deal with, and that's the health accord. And we need to have a government that will ensure the health accord, which sees healthcare funding transferred from Ottawa to British Columbia, continue. And if that's not taking place, then it'll be more than that we're worried about.
And we go on to Adrian Dix, Medicare premiums. Adrian.
Well, Keith is right. On January 1st this year, the government increased MSP premiums by 6%, 18% over 3 years. They increased them by 50% in 2002. And I think right now, probably, the government can't move on that too much. We can't move to eliminate MSP premiums, even though they're a regressive tax. But they've been used to subsidize tax cuts to corporations. I think we need a different approach. I propose specifically rolling back some of those tax cuts to corporations and rolling back the long-term care fee increases that took place also on January 1st. $54 million, which is affecting many vulnerable seniors, especially seniors living at home, who are no longer able to stay at home because their spouse is in long-term care. I've also proposed a specific plan to improve our public health care system, ensure that the home care and primary care services are available to British Columbians. In contrast, Christy Clark has presented cuts to public health care that Georgia Abbott, on this very stage before the Liberal leadership, said were ridiculous.
And John Horgan, Medicare premiums.
MSP premiums in British Columbia is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has MSP premiums in place. As Adrian's outlined, a 50% increase immediately upon forming government, and then now 18% increases year over year, this year, next year, and the year after that. It's a regressive tax. If you make $40,000 a year, you pay the same premium as if you make $400,000 a year, and I believe that's just plain wrong. And that's why one of the reasons I proposed a fair tax commission. I think the citizens of British Columbia need to have a good understanding of where money's coming from so we can have a better understanding of where it needs to go. I think that the MSP premium is a classic example of that. Couple that with the implementation of the HST without consultation, without any understanding of what the impact's going to be on low-income British Columbians, and no impact whatsoever on the bottom lines of large corporations except for that $2 billion transfer. The Fair Tax Commission will allow us to put all of this on the table and come up with coherent answers that the public can get behind rather than run away from.
Thank you, John Horgan. Dana Larson.
Well, I don't think it'd be possible to get rid of MSP premiums right away, but I would certainly work to reduce and eliminate them over my first term in office. I think what we're seeing with MSP premiums is the same kind of thing that we're seeing with our healthcare system, with our educational system, with BC Ferries and BC Hydro. They promised things are going to get better, but we've seen BC Hydro rates going up. They promised that when they made the changes to BC Ferries, things would be better, but we've seen BC Ferry rates going up. I think that this is part of a purposeful strategy by the Liberals. I think they're really neocon Conservatives whose goal is to dismantle much of our common good and commonwealth. I don't think they want to have a successful healthcare system in British Columbia. I don't think they want to have successful crown corporations in British Columbia. I think that goes directly against their ideology. And so I don't think it's an accident that we're seeing more money being pushed into healthcare with less results, and that we're seeing more costs downloaded on regular people. I think that if we manage our healthcare system properly, we can keep the costs under control and we can get rid of those MSP premiums.
And thank you, Dana Larson. The next question comes from Justine Hunter, and the first answer will come from Adrian Dix. Justine.
So the Quebec government has imposed a moratorium on fracking, which actually has nothing to do with Star Wars, but it's the process of injecting water into shale deposits to release natural gas. Should BC do the same thing, and can it afford to do so?
I think BC needs to review fracking. I proposed that specifically in my environmental platform. I think the issues around fracking raise serious questions about public safety, raise serious questions about public health, and they need to be reviewed in British Columbia. What I find disturbing about the issue is how little we know. We have a methodology that causes mini earthquakes when it's used, causes a massive use of water. Water, in the case of Williston Lake, that's now being taken out of our hydro system, and I think that process demands a review. I think people in British Columbia would expect a government to step in and get the answers so that we go in the right direction. Quebec has taken one step on a moratorium. I think we need to get the evidence first before making a decision.
John Horgan, fracking.
Well, just for my geek cred, Justine, the fracking reference would be to Battlestar Galactica, not Star Wars. So I got to get some geek
Thank
cred
you so
on that.
much.
Not a problem, not a problem. I also know a little bit about fracking. I've been the energy critic for the past 4.5, 5 years, and it is a significant problem, particularly with respect to the massive amounts of fresh water that is used to explode the compressed shale play so that the gas can be released. The second problem is, where do you dispose of this toxic water once you remove it from the ground? I believe the biggest concern we should have is that we don't have any baseline, particularly in the Peace Country. We don't have any baseline on how quickly we're recharging the aquifer there. We don't have any baseline on how far down below the water table we need to go to dispose of the toxic water that's produced by fracking. That's an abdication by this government, taking people off the ground, biologists, foresters, agrologists, geologists. The scientists that were setting public policy in British Columbia for generations are no longer employed. That's a direct result of bad policy put in place by the BC Liberals.
Dana Larson, your fracking answer.
I'm absolutely opposed to fracking, and you asked whether or not we can afford not to. I think we can't afford to allow this to happen. It's another example of a short-term gain for a massive long-term cost. And it's the same thing with raw log exports as with fracking. It leaves our province with a big hole and a big mess to clean up. It leaves our rural communities abandoned and forced to deal with the mess left behind by these big corporations that come in, take our resources and take our money and then leave. They don't reinvest in our communities. They don't have a long-term goal or a long-term vision for our province. I strongly believe in letting local communities have greater control over their own resources. I believe that people who live in an area, they have children, they have grandchildren, they understand the community, and they have an interest in the long-term benefit for that community and for the region in which they live. And I think the more we hand over our resources to big corporations to come in and scoop out as much as they can, whether it's trees, whether it's destroying our environment with fracking, I think we have to stand up to that and say enough is enough, because we cannot allow that to continue.
Thank you, Dana. Mike Farnworth on fracking.
I believe we have to review the situation around fracking in British Columbia. I think it's an important public policy issue, and it's an example of where the Liberals have failed. Other jurisdictions have put in a moratorium. Other jurisdictions are doing reviews of the regulations. We need to be engaged in that. What it speaks to, though, is the lack of science-based research around public policy in British Columbia. It calls into question, the gutting in the Ministry of Environment of its budget by 30%. We need the people who are able to do the job, who are ensuring that our groundwater, for example, which fracking involves, is not being compromised in any way. It's one of the reasons why I proposed comprehensive groundwater protection legislation in British Columbia. It's why we need to have an Environmental Assessment Review Act in the province of British Columbia that has the teeth to do the job that the public expects it to do, that it's resourced, that the public has confidence in it, and that it has the staff who are able to ensure that they're putting the public interest of British Columbians first. That is key to good public policy. That's the approach I would take as Premier.
And thank you, Mike Farnworth. And I have a question, and it goes to Dana Larson. So when the Port Mann Bridge twinning project is completed and the Port Mann opens as a twin bridge, the tolls are going to start off at $3 each way, every day, every time you use the bridge. And I'm wondering, do you support those tolls? And if not, how would you reduce them?
I'm not opposed to tolls for drivers. I think as a society we're actually subsidizing car drivers quite a bit. Certainly drivers do pay some of the cost of those roads, but we all subsidize drivers through property taxes, whether or not we have a car. So I'm not opposed to those tolls, but I really think we have to shift our focus in our society and in our province away from cars and away from roads and towards rail and public transport. That is the future of transportation in our province. That is a sustainable way of getting around. And so as Premier, I would invest more heavily in rail, and I would also work to make sure our public transit system is fully accessible, fully funded, and also fare-free. I think that the fares don't really generate a lot of revenue for our transit system. Ultimately, they're more of a barrier to access for many people. So I'm not against tolls on roads, but I think the long-term solution to transport in our province is rail and fare-free public transport.
And yes, I did get out of sequence there, which means I'm going back to John Horgan for an answer on tolls on the Port Mann.
Sure. I've been talking to transportation economists over the past number of months trying to get a handle on the challenges, particularly in the Metro Vancouver area. I've been consulting with people broadly to get an understanding of whether system-based tolls, system-wide tolls would be a solution to spread the costs more evenly from community to community. These are significant challenges. We need new infrastructure to move goods and services and to move people. I agree with Dana that a focus on public transportation would have been my preferred option, but we're well advanced on the Port Mann project. We need now to find out how we're going to pay for it in a way that is distributed across the piece rather than focusing exclusively on those users. I come from Vancouver Island, and I believe that the ferry system is an integral part of our integrated transportation system province-wide. I believe we need to find a balance between paying for those services that move people around that is shared evenly and equitably across the piece. That's what British Columbians would expect. That's what I would do.
And Mike Farnworth, $3 to cross the Port Mann. Do you support it?
Well, a third of the trips out of the Tri-Cities are from our area over the bridge into Surrey, and the bridge is going to be built and those tolls are going to be in place. I think the real issue is to look at what's been happening on the other bridge that's already tolled, which is the Golden Ears Bridge, and that toll seems to have put in place, a diminished. You're not getting the people crossing that was initially anticipated. And I think what we've got to do is look at the result of tolls, the impact of tolls on drivers. The government promised a free alternative. There isn't going to be one, not if tolls are on the Patella Bridge, the new replacement for it. So I think what the government is going to have to do is sit down with local governments and work on a transportation plan that works for the entire region and recognizes the role of tolls in that, and saying, is it fair that one bridge has got such a significant toll on it? We're seeing other bridges being tolled where we're not getting the traffic that they thought, and maybe we have to go back and rethink that and look at tolls on a much wider range of bridge crossings in the Lower Mainland.
Adrian Dix, tolls.
I think a key issue on tolls is the lack of equity. We had a major investment by the government in the Sea to Sky Highway. There were no tolls, but the investment on the Port Mann Bridge has led to significant tolls. I think these are pretty serious issues for people in the Lower Mainland to deal with. You see it a little bit on the Golden Ears, the fact that there isn't enough take-up, there isn't enough utilization of that bridge. So I think we need a different approach, certainly on the Patella Bridge. Any change to the Patella Bridge should be toll-free if there's a toll in the Port Mann, unless we address the issue of system tolls. So I think we need to we shouldn't treat people in Surrey and in the Fraser Valley differently than others. Everyone knows we have to pay for transportation infrastructure. It's why I proposed, especially for transit, to use carbon tax money for transit in order to ensure that we have the resources to buy the buses and to build the routes that are already in the government's plan and agreed to, but they have no money to finance.
So we've got another segment now where the candidates get to ask each other a question, and because of the way the rotation works, we're back to Dana Larson. Your question.
Sure. I've got a question for Adrian Dix. Adrian, our healthcare system in this province seems to be in a mess. Long-term beds are being closed and elderly patients are being shuffled into acute care beds, which cost vastly more. Hospitals are understaffed, leading to increased costs in the long run. We've seen patients being treated in a Tim Hortons, and hallway care has even become normalized in hospitals across our province. Some people say this is part of a deliberate strategy by the Liberals, that they're neoconservatives who are using shock doctrine tactics to destroy our healthcare system, but others say it's simply incompetence and that they just don't really know how to run things properly and that they're more interested in corporate profits than in people. So what's your opinion on that, and what steps would you take to restore public health care for all British Columbians?
Well, I think, Dana, there's a third option, which is a combination of the first two. But I think what we have to do is address the real issue in public health care, which is the government's failure to address in those parts of the public health care system that are less expensive and will relieve pressure on acute care. You know, acute care beds in British Columbia cost $1,000 a day. In long-term care, it's probably between $150 and $200 to the public a day. Home care and home support costs much worse. And the government's failure to address long-term care, their failure to address home care and home support have led to pressure on acute care hospitals. But in Fraser Health, you referred to Royal Columbian Hospital. That one's pretty simple. You know, there were in that day, there were 65 patients in the emergency room admitted to the hospital who couldn't go up to the wards because the wards were jammed. The BC Liberal government, a government that Christy Clark was part of, closed the nearest hospital, St. Mary's, that has caused many of these problems.
Danny, you've got a bit of time left on the clock. If you want to say a bit more, go ahead.
I would just say I think they're incompetent neoconservatives.
Okay. Mike Farnworth, your question.
My question is for John Horgan. John, as you know, public safety has been an issue of concern to many British Columbians right across the province. We've seen some horrific crimes take place in the Lower Mainland, gangland violence. We've also seen issues around emergency call issues on the South Island. But one of the key things that's going to be areas of public policy going to be taking place is the renegotiation of the RCMP contract. What changes would you like to see with regards to the RCMP contract?
Well, I have two RCMP detachments in my community on the South Island, in Langford, the West Shore, and another detachment in Souk, and I used to have the detachment in Shawnigan Lake as well. They're underfunded, they're understaffed, and it's a critical problem in communities that depend on the RCMP, certainly on the island. I've had the opportunity to talk to mayors in the metro area about the challenges of integration. I support integration of municipal and RCMP forces to ensure that we get the best service we can for the people of the regions that are represented by those areas. But ultimately, I think the government has failed by not putting forward an alternative to just re-upping with the RCMP. We should have had on the table a proposal that could focus on a provincial police force. Then we could ensure that these forces are adequately resourced, that they are integrated with municipal forces, and the outcomes would be better for all British Columbians. By only having a negotiation with one side, we have failed, in my opinion, to use our buying power, as 30% of the RCMP is in British Columbia.
Horgan.
There you go.
Mike Farnworth, do you want to say a bit more on that one?
So, John, what I understand from your answer is that local governments, you're saying to local government that you think that the provincial police force is an option for British Columbia that they should be considering?
I'm saying I've been consulting with local politicians, and I believe that the provincial government has failed by not having a provincial police force option on the table so that they can have a true negotiation from a position of strength rather than a position of
They've
weakness.
completely abandoned the format. What am I going to do with these people?
Let us go.
We'll go to
go.
Adrian Dix.
Let John be free. Question for Mike. I've proposed specific improvements to public education to address class size and composition, to to address the FSA test, to address issues of bargaining. You proposed an education commission, which in your original announcement would put off decisions on many of these key items that are facing our public schools for years into the future. What items would you like to deal with now, and what items do you see the commission taking care of?
Thank you for that question, Adrian. Actually, you have it wrong. The Royal Commission on Education is intended to take a comprehensive look at education in British Columbia right now and to see where we need to be over the next 10 or 15 years. It's intended to look at early childhood learning, the K-12 system, post-secondary education, skills training, and adult learning in a comprehensive view. See what's being done best here in British Columbia. Look at what changes and what's being done in other jurisdictions in Canada as well as overseas. There's some really interesting innovations taking place in Europe. Finland is often mentioned by many teachers. I don't see this as delaying some of the key changes that need to be made in terms of education right now. We need to address the chronic issue of underfunding in our schools. The issue of FSAs is not something that I would put off until for a Royal Commission. That's something that I think that we can deal with, as is class size and composition. I think those are all important issues that need to be addressed in the first term of an NDP government, and in fact in the first session of a government of which I'm Premier.
And thank you, Mr. Farnworth. And Adrian, you got a bit of time left. If you want to use it, go ahead.
Oh, the Commission proposal says you will deal with the issue of assessment by the Commission, so I'm glad to see you've joined my proposal to address foundation skills assessments now, although you didn't say how you would do that. Equally, we're entering a bargaining round right now with teachers, And so the issue of class size and composition can't be put off either. I think a student who's in grade 4 today needs answers before they reach grade 7 in a public school system that the BC Liberals have put into crisis. That's why I've made specific proposals for change.
John Horgan, you get the last question in this segment. Fire away.
Okay, I'll pose a question to Adrian. Adrian, I've been talking about the importance of a robust private sector economy. I've been saying that I welcome private sector investment, provided that investment understands that they have to be mindful and respectful of our rigorous environmental policies. They have to be mindful and respectful of the labor force that we put in place, a skilled, trained labor force, and they also have to pay their fair share of taxes. What steps would you take to encourage private sector investment in British Columbia?
Well, firstly, with our forest industry, which is one of the most important industries in our province, as needless to say, maybe the most important in many communities, I proposed specific changes that would ensure that raw logs are processed in British Columbia. I think that's critical for a lot of communities, critical for a lot of private sector manufacturers who right now can't get access to fiber. On the mining industry, I proposed specifically a mining center of excellence which would ensure that we had the highest standards of mining in British Columbia. I've also proposed improvements to healthcare and education, which in other jurisdictions are a major cost and are a cost being increasingly shifted off to private sector plans. I think those changes will ensure that the private sector economy is healthy.
And we have time in this format for extra questions because you've been so disciplined in your answers. And we're going to start with a question from Keith Baldry, and it is going to go to Adrian Dix.
All right, thanks, Juan. You've all been critical of the BC Liberal government tearing up contracts, freely negotiated contracts. The BC government has signed an agreement with Ottawa to implement the HST and receive $1.6 billion for doing that. Federal NDP leader Jack Layton has proposed in the federal campaign of scrapping the tax and not paying that money back to Ottawa. Isn't that just another form of contract breaking?
That's I think, an excellent proposal, which just about everyone in British Columbia would support. I think would be absolutely unfair for British Columbia to be treated differently than other provinces, to be treated unfairly. But look, I'm against the HST. I've been against the HST for 16 years. Now, the BC Liberals were against it for 14 years until the day after the last provincial election. I'm against the HST because I believe it takes responsibility away from British Columbia and hands it over to Ottawa. I'm against the HST because it pushes costs on to small businesses and working people. And that's why I will lead the NDP in the referendum to oppose the HST and reinstate the PST. I think it's wrong to make single decisions and important decisions about tax policy based on a one-time payment in any event. But I think that Jack Layton's proposal is one that everyone should support in BC, and it's why the NDP is going to win a majority of seats in BC in this federal election.
And John Horgan giving back the $1.6 billion to Ottawa.
Well, first of all, we accepted that $1.6 billion over 3 fiscal years, and a portion of that has been expended. I believe that the last portion was just passed on in this previous budget in February, the one that has not been debated. We've sat 4 days in the past 10 months, ladies and gentlemen. It's outrageous that the people of BC are not being adequately represented in their legislature. The challenge of the $1.6 billion is not as significant a challenge as the BC Liberals and those who are supporting the HST would have you believe. This, in our country, fiscal federalism means that there are transfer payments all the time. Money transferred from British Columbia to Ottawa, money transferred from Ottawa to British Columbia. We can negotiate, surely, we can negotiate in good faith a deal that would stretch out the payments of that $1.6 billion back to Ottawa in a way that meets the interests of the federal government and meets the interests of the people of British Columbia. With respect to Jack Layton's proposal, I support that wholeheartedly and will be voting for the federal NDP candidate in my constituency because I don't believe that British Columbians should be held ransom by bad decisions of a previous government and forced to vote yes in a referendum to save money.
And over to you, Dana Larson.
Well, I'll be voting against the HST, and this is one of the reasons why I propose strengthening our referendum system in British Columbia. I believe that we need more direct democracy in our province so that the people of British Columbia can have a say in these kind of issues. And maybe if we had more of a better referendum system earlier on, we could have stopped the destruction of BC Hydro or the scandalous sell-off of BC Rail and other tactics the Liberals have engaged in, which they promised not to do before they came into power. Also, I believe that whatever happens with the HST, HST. And certainly if we reject it, you're right, we got to pay a big check back to the federal government. That's why we have to start looking at new sources of revenue in our province and being open to new ideas. And one proposal I put forward is having a premier who would stand up for our cannabis industry in our province. And so I say, tax THC, no HST.
Over to you, Mike Farnworth.
Well, absolutely, I support Jack's proposal because I think it's a great one for British Columbia. I think the real issue right now around the HST is the fact there's a federal election on, and we have an opportunity to send the feds a real clear message by electing NDP MPs that British Columbians expect to be treated fairly after this election when they defeat the HST in the referendum. What really concerns me is the fact that our provincial government has been silent. Christy Clark has said nothing. There's no reason why we cannot be standing up now saying that British Columbians should not be negatively impacted when the people make a decision to end the HST. There's no reason. The federal government's already indicated a willingness to sit down with the province, and I know from past experience that the federal government is quite able to negotiate with the provinces this type of agreements and paying back the 1.6 or whatever it is, whether it's over 3, 10 or 15 years. But what's crucial is that we get the best deal for British Columbia, and that means having a government that will stand up for BC.
Thank you for the answers, and we have time for one more question. Justine Hunter will ask it, and it will start with John Horgan.
Increased gambling in BC means more money for government, and that means more money for services. Would you increase gambling, put a cap on it, or reduce it?
I proposed pulling the plug on online gambling in British Columbia. The Play Now website, which was marred by hacking and marred by confusion and chaos when it was launched, in my opinion, is a grotesque attempt by the BC Liberals to go right into people's homes and extract money from them when they can least afford it. I am not a gambler myself. I don't believe that that's something that I would spend my time doing, but I don't begrudge other citizens wanting to go to their local casino or their local bingo hall to have some entertainment. But when the state, when the government of British Columbia intrudes into your home through the internet to take money out of your pocket when you can least afford it, I believe that's wrong. I would roll that back. I would also start a negotiation again with the not-for-profits and arts groups that were guaranteed by the NDP government in the 1990s a 25% share of the revenues that came from gambling so that they could go into communities for good social purposes, good artistic purposes. That's not happening anymore. We need to readdress that social contract that we have between the people and the Crown with respect to gambling, and I will do that.
Thank you, John Horgan. Dana Larson.
Well, I don't advocate banning gambling. I think that will put it back into alleyways and lead to an unregulated, uncontrolled gambling system that ultimately is worse for people who want to engage in that behavior. But I also don't think that we want to become dependent on gambling revenue and seek to increase gambling to balance our budget. So much like the carbon tax, where that money is getting put back into general revenue instead of being put where it belongs, which is to build more public transit and to make the shift away from a carbon-based society. I also think that gambling revenue should not go into general revenue either, but should be directed to charities and to other groups that help to improve our society. I think that's where that money should go. And so I don't advocate banning gambling. I think we need a regulated and licensed policy around that. We can recognize it's a normal behavior, but at the same time, we don't want to become dependent upon gambling revenue to balance our budget.
Mike Farnworth, gambling.
Gaming is a fact of life here in British Columbia. It's not going to go away. I'm not in favor of expanding gambling in the province. What I am in favor of is ensuring that we have a regulatory regime that ensures that, one, enforcement is taking place in terms of issues around money laundering and that the government's providing the resources for that to happen. Second, we do know there are problems around problem gambling in British Columbia, and we need to make sure, again, that the government's putting resources to that area so that people can get the help that they need. We need to be doing a better job of working with our casinos, for example, on exclusion policies so that people who do have gambling addiction problems don't have the ability to enter into a casino. And finally, we need to recognize that gaming revenues support a lot of charities in British Columbia, and that they should be able to count on that revenue and it not being diverted from them by whim or by decree of a government in power. And I think that means sitting down and negotiating in good faith with them a sharing arrangement.
And Adrian Dix, last answer, Adrian.
Well, I don't think we should be expanding gambling any further than we have now, and I believe actually the market for expanded gambling isn't there any longer. I also believe, as others have said here, that we should ensure that charities and nonprofits get a share of gambling money. It seems to me that that deal has been broken and continues to be broken by the new government. $22 million less than 2008 levels going to charities right now. That is taking money off the table and affecting in every way arts groups, seniors groups, community groups across British Columbia. I don't think it makes sense. And finally, I think that the whole issue of addiction is one the government hasn't addressed well. When you see addiction money inadequately addressing people with gambling problems at a time when gambling revenues are skyrocketing, it's a sign of a government that doesn't care enough about people.
And that's it for the answers. And we now move to the very last segment of the NDP Leadership Forum here on Shaw TV. Closing statements, reverse order from the way we started. Dana Larson, go ahead.
Hey, well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share some of my views and ideas with our viewers. I've based my campaign upon 4 pillars: democracy, sustainability, social justice, and smart on crime. You know, I really believe the NDP must live up to our grassroots and make sure that our members are always empowered to shape policy and be involved. And I want to improve democracy in our province by strengthening our referendum system as well. For sustainability, I really believe in taking a long-term view of how we use resources in our province, and I would like to shift away from cars and roads and towards public transport and rail as the primary means of getting around in British Columbia. For social justice, I've talked about tax reform, rolling back the corporate tax cuts which have not done what they were promised, which was to create jobs and investment, and also making sure that the top earners in our province pay their fair way and that the richest 0.6% have a little tax bump to make sure that they're all kicking in appropriately. And for being smart on crime, I really believe that we need to stand up to Stephen Harper's prison spending spree, for which he wants the provinces to foot the bill. And I don't believe that prison is a solution for homelessness, for drug addiction, or for mental health issues, and that more police is not the way to make our society safer. So as leader of the NDP and as Premier, I would try to provide the same kind of visionary, bold programs and ideas that I brought forward in this campaign. And if you're a member of the NDP, I hope you'll consider giving me a high preference on your preferential ballot. Thank you.
And closing statement to you, John Horgan.
Well, thank you, Bon, and panelists, and I also want to thank Shaw for having us in here today to put this program forward to British Columbians. I got into this race 90 days ago. I was about 20 pounds heavier, and I came into it because this was an opportunity that I thought I could not pass up. In my entire adult life, the 2 political solitudes, the 2 divides in British Columbia have been bashing against each other relentlessly, whether it be the Social Credit Liberal Alliance, whether it be the New Democratic Party. I saw this leadership race as an opportunity not to just talk to people within the NDP, but to talk over the NDP to other citizens, other British Columbians. It's my view, my firm view, that New Democrat values are mainstream values. I believe that most British Columbians are New Democrats, they just don't know it yet. And my attempt over the past 90 days has been to talk to British Columbians about the values that join us together, the issues that bring us back together as a community that wants to be progressive, that wants a robust economy, that wants social justice, ecological protection for our natural resources. We want to have educational opportunities for all. But most importantly, in my opinion, we need to restore integrity in the government that's not been there over the past 10 years. I will not make promises I can't keep. I will not say one thing to one group and another thing to a different group. I will speak my mind wherever I go, whenever I can. I don't sound like the other bears in the circus. That's why I believe I will be able to change the face of British Columbia politics. On April 17th, to you New Democrats out there, vote for John Horgan for a better tomorrow, for putting people first. Thank you very much.
Adrian Dix, your closing statement.
Oh, thank you to you, Vaughn. Thank you to the panelists. This has been an amazing campaign for me. I've visited 49 communities around BC over the last 90 days. And it's been an extraordinary experience. I've tried in this campaign to put the voters first, the members of the NDP first, the healthcare worker who had her job privatized in 2002, a single mom now working 72 hours a week in order to feed her family, the forest worker who lost his job and sees raw logs leaving our province at an alarming rate, the restaurateur who lost his business because of the HST, the senior who may have to move because of increases in long-term care fees. 1,433,000 British Columbians were registered to vote and didn't vote in the last provincial election. I'm running for leader of the NDP to give them something to vote for, something to believe in, like a health care plan that makes sense, that improves services for seniors and makes our health care system more cost efficient, an education plan that addresses the crisis in our public schools and supports students and teachers, a plan to stop raw log exports in British Columbia, a plan to use the carbon tax the way it should be used on environmental initiatives, I believe if we have specific proposals on the economy, on health care, on the environment, on education, we will win the next general election. And more important than that, we will have a mandate to bring the change British Columbia needs.
And the last closing statement, Mike Farnworth.
Thank you, Vaughn. Thank you, panelists. Over the last few months, I've had the opportunity to travel all over our great province and meet with thousands of New Democrats and British Columbians. And they've been clear to me. They want a change of government. They want a government that wants to work with people, not against them. We can have that change if we win the next election. The question is, how do we win it? Some have said the way to do that is to divide British Columbians, pit one group against another. I reject that approach. I think there's a better way. I think we win the next election by uniting our caucus, uniting our party, uniting British Columbians with a vision that speaks to their concerns and their priorities. During this campaign, I've been the candidate who's been doing that. I've been uniting our caucus, I've been uniting our party, and just as importantly, I've been building a base of support amongst the public. Not just traditional NDP voters, but those new voters that we need to reach if we're to form a government and win that next election. Under my leadership, the NDP will become electable. Under my leadership, the NDP will be seen as a government in waiting. That's what all of us want who are on this platform. To win the next election, to be able to put in place the changes that I know all of us want to see happen. We live in an amazing province. There's nothing we can't do if we don't have a government that will work with people. That's why I'm asking for your vote on the 17th of April.
And thank you very much. We're done. Thank you to the candidates for being on the panel and for being here and talking to you today. Mike Farnworth, Adrian Dix, Dana Larson, and John Horgan. Thanks to my fellow panelists, Keith Baldry from Global Television, Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail. And thank you for watching at home. Good afternoon.